Good afternoon, everybody. My name is E.R. Anderson. I'm the executive director of Charis Circle. Charis Circle is the nonprofit programming arm of Charis Books, and Charis Books is the South's oldest independent feminist bookstore. Charis is also the school store partner for Agnes Scott College, and today's event is, of course, co-sponsored by Agnes Scott College. We are excited to welcome James Diedrick and Leeanne M. Richardson for a discussion of their books, Mathilde Blind, Selected Fin-de-Siècle Poetry and Prose, and The Forms of Michael Feld. Or Field, actually, I should have asked which one it is. Thank you, yes. We're glad to have our Agnes Scott colleagues in the chat, as well as folks from Georgia State and our Charis community, and perhaps some students as well. So thank you all for joining us for this midday event. We hope you've brought some lunch, perhaps, and are able to hang out with us for a little while. We're going to have presentations on both books. We're going to start with Leeanne, and then we will also have time for questions. So you may put questions in the chat. You can also put them in the Ask a Question box, and I will be coming back on it towards the end to help ask those questions and facilitate that part. So first, I'll introduce Leeanne. Leeanne M. Richardson is an associate professor of English at Georgia State University who studies British literature and culture with a focus on the years 1880 to 1820. This focus allows her to read and teach authors like Oscar Wilde and H.G. Wells and works like Dracula and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. The author of The Forms of Michael Feld, which came out from Palgrave last year, Richardson in this book discusses the aunt and niece pair who created an artistic life together as poet Michael Feld and who created real-world, non-conforming gender identities by living as Michael and Henry Richardson. Has also published on other late 19th century women novelists and poets like Olive Schreiner, Dolly Radford, and Amy Levy, people whose names might not be familiar, but whose works are fabulous. So we were talking in the green room about how 1880 to 1920 is when all the best literature, especially weird literature, came into being. So I am really excited to hear so much queer literature came into being at that time too, which I think is often not recognized. So I'm excited to be talking about that with y'all today. And we're also here with James Dietrich. James is a semi-retired professor of English at Agnes Scott College. Forgive me. He is the author of Mathilde Blind, The Late Victorian Culture and the Women of Letters, which came out from the University of Virginia Press. He has also co-edited a collection of essays on filmmaker Stanley Kubrick and has published articles on Charlotte Bronte, George Eliot, and Elizabeth Robins Pennell, among others. At Agnes Scott, he has taught courses on Victorian literature, film, and graphic novels. His most recent publication is the book that we are celebrating today. And we are just really happy to have you all here. So thanks to everybody shouting out already in the chat, which is great. I'm going to get out of the way and we'll get right into it. So I believe we're starting with Leeanne, and thank y'all both for being here.
Thank you, ER, and thank you to Charis, both for hosting this talk and for being such an important part of the Atlanta community. The latest Charis Circle newsletter included reflections on the hearing of Supreme Court Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson. And I'm just going to read, it was a great piece. I'm going to read just the beginning and the end. At Charis, we believe in complexity, not because we want to make things hard to understand or accessible only to people with elite educations, but because we believe all human beings are complicated and deserve the respect and dignity of not reducing aspects of ourself which are irreducible. The dignity of us all is in the details. Let us celebrate our complexity. And so I wanted to especially thank Charis for being a place where complex questions and complex identities are embraced. It's also an ideal space for the women writers that James and I will be talking about today. And I will read selections from my book's first two chapters, which give an introduction to Michael Feld and their career. Chapters 3 through 8 have deep dives into specific works. I do want to give those unfamiliar with Michael Feld's work a little taste of what their poetry is like, and so I'll read a couple of my favorite of their shorter poems at the end. The singular name Michael Feld, paired with the plural pronoun they, will sound natural to this audience, but Michael Feld would not have appreciated it. Catherine Bradley and her niece Edith Cooper created Michael Feld as their singular poetic identity, and insisted that people use the singular masculine pronoun to refer to him. This is not because Bradley and Cooper objected to non-normative gender identities. Rather, they understood the publishing market they wanted to break into. Bradley wrote to the poet Robert Browning, upset that he had revealed the secret of the two women behind Michael Field, saying that confirmation that Michael Field was comprised of two women would, quote, be utter ruin to us. And she explains why. The report of lady authorship will dwarf and enfeeble our work at every turn. We have many things to say that the world will not tolerate from a woman's lips. And the fact that most people have not heard of Michael Field, despite their significant success in the 1880s and 1890s, suggests that Bradley knew what she was talking about. Michael Field was well known in London literary circles and extremely prolific. From 1884 to 1914, they published 29 dramas and 8 volumes of poetry. A drama a year, easily. They were constantly present and people knew them. The best part, Bradley and Cooper also wrote 28 co-written volumes of diaries that they titled Works and Days. They kept from 1888 until their deaths, and it's a treasure trove of them as people. A little biographical background. Catherine Bradley moved in with her sister and brother-in-law a year before Edith Cooper was born. Just 16 years Edith Cooper's senior, Bradley was half surrogate parent and half companion to Edith as she was growing up. Bradley went alone to the Collège de France and Newnham College, Cambridge, but she and Cooper attended University College Bristol together, studying Greek and Latin and developing an intellectual and aesthetic affinity that they would share throughout their lives. Even after their formal education ended, they continued to study together, reading up on everything: Japanese art, continental philosophy, traveling with the American art critic Bernard Berenson to the capitals of Europe to study the history of Western painting. They were consciously aesthetic, both in dress and literary temperament, and they identified themselves with the modern. This modernity extended both to the lives they lived and the works they wrote, and they continually strove to find the right forms to express their ideas and beliefs, including several self-invented marriage ceremonies to sacralize their union. They lived together their entire lives until each died of cancer less than a year apart. Cooper died at 51 in 1913, and Bradley died 9 months later, age 67. In 1884, Bradley and Cooper found immediate success with their first publication as Michael Field. The verse drama Calurori, it's a Greek name, they loved the Greeks and the Romans. So Calurori made Michael Field's reputation when Richard Holt Hutton, who was the owner and editor of The Spectator, announced the arrival of a new poet, asserting that the poetry of Calurori sounds like the ring of a new voice, which is likely to be heard far and wide among English-speaking peoples. Hutton's review was only the first among many that announced a vital poetic voice that needed to be heard. It was also around this time, a side note, that Bradley famously claimed that she and Cooper had a more significant relationship than Robert Browning and his wife, Elizabeth Barrett Browning. She wrote, "Those two poets, man and wife, wrote alone. Each wrote but did not bless or quicken one another at their work. We are closer married." It was Robert Browning who outed Michael Field as two women, and a slow shift in critical consensus followed, undoubtedly resulting from gendered ideas about what was appropriate to women writers. But Calurori, the supposed product of a vigorous male brain, showed, quote, something almost of Shakespearean penetration. 10 years later, when it was well known that there were two women behind the male name, the Daily Chronicle was explicitly advising Michael Field to be more feminine. If Michael Field will but write us gentle, gracious, intimate things, the pseudonym may achieve a place among the poets of the time. Right, from obviously gendered terms, the masculine penetration, to the need to be gentle and, gracious. Bradley's letter to Browning proved prophetic. She and Cooper had many things to say that the world would not tolerate from a woman's lips. Bradley and Cooper intimately understood how categories influence reception, evident in their early understanding of how gender would impact the judgment of the critics. Accordingly, Michael Field fashions each of their books in a way that uses specific poetic forms, like songs, sonic, ekphrastic poetry, devotional poems, verse drama, masque. They use each form to direct the manner in which readers will respond to and understand their work. For example, when people read lyric poetry, they often presume a kind of authentic subjectivity is at work. The I of the poem, right, seems obviously identical with the author. This is actually a fairly modern idea, one that grew throughout the 19th century from the Romantic poets on. But in any case, we tend to think of the I of the poem as the poet. Think of Elizabeth Barrett Browning's sonnet, "How do I love thee? Let me count the ways." We know that her sonnets from the Portuguese were written to the man she eventually married, and assume that this poem reflects her authentic emotions. This does not work for Michael Field. Although all of Michael Field's poetry is written as though it is intensely personal, the persona means that their verse can never be read as an expression of Bradley or Cooper's individual subjectivity. Moreover, Michael Field gravitates toward verse forms that complicate the relationship of speaker to poet. Drama, most obviously, is never expected to represent the true voice of its author, right? But rather its characters with a lot of different subject positions. Even in their lyric poetry, though, Michael Field seeks ways to keep themselves distinct from the I of the poem. For example, their first book of short poems, called Long Ago, consists of poetic fragments by Sappho that they extend into full poems. The scholar Jopi Prins expresses the complexity of the subjectivity here excellently. "How shall we read," she writes, "how shall we read these poems written by two women, writing as a man, writing as Sappho?" There are 3 degrees of separation between the persona and the person. And this complex relation of persona to person is where the Michael Field identity gets really interesting. Michael Field is not just a pseudonym so that Bradley and Cooper can receive the kind of critical judgments that a man would earn. Michael Field became a lived persona. So not only did Bradley and Cooper create Michael Field to be the author of their works, the Michael Field identity helped the 2 women form their personal lived identities, as Catherine Bradley became known as Michael, and Edith Cooper was called Field, and then increasingly Henry or Henny in their daily lives. They loved nicknames. A reimagined voice of lyric verse, freed from communicating authentic subjectivity, is one result of Bradley's and Cooper's joint persona. But there's another. In addition to reading their poetry as a way of rethinking assumptions about genres, it's useful to consider identity as itself a genre, right? A genre of being rather than writing, with specific formal properties and modes of communication. Bradley and Cooper's freedom with gender suggests that they consider identity as adaptable and malleable as the poetic genres with which they work. Gender and genre share the same Greek root, and Michael Field plays with both. Bradley and Cooper's modes of self-creation speak forcefully to our current cultural moment, since they formed what might now be termed gender-fluid identities. Instead of accepting what their culture gave them, they created gender identities exclusive to themselves, and they played out modes of subjectivity and desire through their creation of Michael Field. Michael Field is unique, self-constructed, and exceptional. But at the same time, Michael Field's forms, both literary and personal, are based on inherited modes and modified in the crucible of current debates and trends. Bradley and Cooper were intensely involved in the literary, artistic, social, and philosophical debates of their time. They knew most of the cultural workers in London. They were very self-consciously modern. Michael Field grew out of Bradley and Cooper's wide-ranging reading and their immersion in modern thought, which helped them understand that identity is not predetermined or unchanging or divinely ordered. In constructing Michael Field, as well as Michael and Field, Bradley and Cooper could make conscious decisions about elements of personality often accepted as given. They eschewed many markers of female life, heterosexual marriage, children, domestic duties. The freedom that followed allowed them to pursue many privileges of male life: membership in a club, a literary career, homeownership, foreign travel, university education, smoking. More important, though, these choices gained for them independence of thought and action, unrestricted by assumptions of what is proper for women to do and think. At the same time, their conscious self-creation allowed them to blur conventional gendered boundaries so that they could preserve those elements of traditional femininity that accorded with their self-expression. For example, they loved clothes, and their diaries are full of descriptions of their latest dresses and hats. In 1901, Edith writes about her appreciation of the dressmaker, "My cherished Miss Wells," who she says has a diploma from God for secondary creation. By becoming Michael and Field in their lived lives, Bradley and Cooper reveal that their own identities are self-created, just like Michael Field's. And as Michael and Field, rather than Catherine and Edith, Bradley and Cooper are able both to reimagine their roles as late Victorian women and to spur others to similarly reconceptualize categories of gender, sex, and number. Their friends always address them as Michael and Henry or Field. Even the father confessors who guide them when they convert to Catholicism in 1908 respect their names and pronouns of choice. Literally, letters will begin, "Dear Michael," and say things like, "How is Henry? I hope he is well." They respect their preferences. All three are conscious constructs created in dialogue, and it's impossible to entirely distinguish among Michael Field and Bradley and Cooper. They're all bound up in one another, created in concert with one another, and it's art that mediates these identities. Art is the key term here. All three identities are directed toward imagination and creation, and toward the freedom to do what art requires. Although Michael Field's reinsertion into the canon of women's poetry has been framed as a recovery of lesbian women's voices, both Bradley and Cooper write in the diaries of their intense physical and emotional attraction to men. This is not a claim that Bradley and Cooper's attraction to men demonstrate that they're actually heterosexual, just as the compelling textual evidence doesn't prove that they're somehow authentically lesbian. Rather, Bradley and Cooper experience and express a range of erotic attractions that both track pre-existing identity categories and diverge from them. For Cooper, as she summed up the year 1903, there is no contradiction in proclaiming her desire for Bernard Berenson immediately before writing, "Oh, what perfect joy there is in the way Michael and I love. So rarely love has this passionate discretion. We are free and more to each other with each year." This freedom does include erotic attachment to others. As Cooper writes in the same diary entry, "There has been for us a year of high creativeness, of deepening magic in the relation of Michael and Fay," their nickname for the artist Charles Rickens, of wide vitality in my relationship with doctrine," which was Berenson's nickname. Such declarations remind us of the scholar Natasha Distiller's observation that human sexuality exceeds the labels that society developed. To assert for most of the writers at the turn of the 20th century a straightforwardly modern gay or lesbian identity is thus to leave out of the equation much murky detail. Or as the Charis newsletter put it, the dignity of us all is in the details. Bradley and Cooper's identity categories are nonetheless linked with pre-existing forms which they employ and revise as a foundation for their reimagined subjectivity. One example is their embrace of marriage as the way to describe their relationship. In periods of change, when things are in upheaval, marriage is positioned as the one solid fact on which they can rely. But while "my wife" is the constant refrain of early letters between Bradley and Cooper, later diaries have them more likely refer to "my fellow." Even though the form of marriage may still obtain, they shift its terms to be gender-free and non-hierarchical. Bradley and Cooper's embrace of the modern enables them to reimagine nearly every element of social life, because for them, the modern represents the fresh moral considerations that emerge when inherited ideologies no longer dominate. Cooper is careful to distinguish between the unmoral and the immoral. In her modern philosophy, immorality is when one is, quote, thinking or acting or speaking against his own beliefs, his own vital principle. Therefore, the unmoral path means being true to your personal ethic. Although conventional thought tends to conflate social rules with divinely ordered right action, when Bradley and Cooper are unconventional, they are not immoral or even impious. Their later embrace of Nietzsche and then of Catholicism reflects a worship that stresses the divinity of human imagination and aspiration, that celebrates what Christ gave to humanity instead of what God forbade it. Michael Field authorizes freedom from inherited roles and freedom to create art. Notably, the signifiers that are generally considered foundational to identity, gender, position within the family, sexuality, did not determine the identities of Michael Field, of Bradley, or of Cooper. Poetry, aesthetics, and imaginative creativity did. Michael Field was a creation that itself enabled creation. And that's the end of my formal talk, but I definitely do want to share, I do have time, just two short poems, and they are poems that stress the passion and creation that was so important to Michael Field. The first, a girl, her soul a deep waved pearl, dim, lucent of all lovely mysteries. A face flowered for heart's ease, a brow's grace soft as seas seen through faint forest trees. A mouth, the lips apart, like aspen leaflets trembling in the breeze from her tempestuous heart. Such, and our souls so knit, I leave a page half writ. The work begun will be to heaven's conception done, if she come to it. And a lovely short poem. And without comment, I'll just go on and read one other. It's one of their best known poems. It was deep April, and the morn Shakespeare was born. The world was on us, pressing sore. My love and I took hands and swore against the world to be poets and lovers evermore, to laugh and dream on Lethe's shore, to sing to Charon in his boat, heartening the timid souls afloat, of judgment never to take heed, but to those fast-locked souls to speed, who never from Apollo fled, who spent no hour among the dead, continually with them to dwell, indifferent to heaven and hell. I'll turn things over here to James.
Thank you, Leanne. And also thanks to ER, and of course, thanks to the irreplaceable Charis Books, who does so much to promote these kinds of discussions and the world of books and ideas in Decatur and Greater Atlanta, and increasingly around the world because of our virtual capabilities. It's also wonderful to see so many friends and colleagues, especially those from Agnes Scott and Georgia State University. So glad you could take time out on this busy day of a busy month for academics to join us. And I want to start my remarks today in the 21st century, or circling back to Victorian England, 21st century America, because I think these two periods speak to each other in compelling ways. And I did notice that Leanne in her remarks never used the word in our title. So perhaps out of overcompensation, I'll be using the word queer much more than I need to, but I hope it will be complementary to Leanne's remarks. I wanted to share the screen though, for a period of time anyway, and see if I can find this document. I think it's in my Chrome tab. It's a page that some of you will know well from a book some of you will know well. It's the wonderful 2007 coming-of-age memoir by Alison Bechdel, Fun Home. And I wanted to focus for a few minutes on the page having to do with her puzzling out the meaning of queer as marker and word. Bechdel was 20 when her father died in 1980. And in trying to come to terms with his and her own queer identities, she sought answers in her family's copy of Webster's dictionary, likely published sometime in the 1960s. She highlights 5 of the definitions, which I have there on the page. It may be a little bit hard to read out, but I will read the 5 definitions and number them to help us keep track. The first is at variance with what is usual or normal in character, appearance, or action, differing in some odd way from what is ordinary. Odd, singular, strange. And that's all the first one. 2, suspicious. 3, qualmish. I love that word, qualmish, faint, not feeling well physically. 4, to thwart, ruin, to put in a bad position. And finally, 5, to counterfeit. And Bechdel applies all of the negative connotations that are gathered in these definitions involving strangeness, harm to reputation, ruin, and false consciousness to herself, her father, and her family life. Had she come of age 10 years later, had her father not been brought down by denial and shame, and had she read a dictionary published after the 1980s, she might have embraced the term queer proudly, to proudly describe herself with queer pride as a member of the queer nation. Since, as we know, by the late 1980s, queer was being used by many in place of gay or homosexual without regard to or in implicit denial of its negative connotations. Those negative associations relating to sexual identity specifically entered the language most famously during the Oscar Wilde trials in the 1890s, which Wilde lost when his lover's father accused him of being a posing sodomite, although he misspelled the word as sondomite. And he brought forth evidence of Wilde's homosexual relations and practices. More to my semantic point, though, the Marquis of Queensberry wrote this in a letter to his son about the outcome of these trials. Quote, "I write to tell you that it is a judgment on the whole lot of you, Montgomerys, the snob queers like Rosebery, and certainly Christian hypocrite Gladstone," unquote. In using the term in this context, possibly the first time the word was used derogatorily against a gay person, the Marquis unintentionally expanded its meaning. And we could talk about Foucault's important book, The History of Sexuality, that talks about the construction of the psychic identity of queerness or gayness and how it actually expanded the possibility for a liberation movement. But we don't have time. Anyway, he may have been the first to use this term in this derogatory sense, but it would take another 100 years for this expansiveness to become liberatory. Partly in response to the Wilde trials and their cultural effect in demonizing sexual difference, Mathilde Blind's friend and fellow writer Vernon Lee wrote an important essay in 1896 in the wake of the trials that implicitly rejects such negative connotations while appropriating the word queer as a badge of honor. She argues that artistic creativity arises from the artist's isolation within an indifferent, at times hostile social setting, and that artists resist this hostility by finding solidarity in what she called, quote, "the queer comradeship of outlawed thought," a phrase I really love. I think it applies in many ways to many situations, many of us. While never explicitly associating the word with sexual identity or practice, Lee, who was herself gay, is clearly wanting here both to expand and valorize the word and meaning of queer to encompass all manner of what we might call free thought, a very Victorian term that was used to describe oppositional ideas about religion, yes, but also politics, class relations, as well as gender and sexuality. And this brings me to the subject of my edited and annotated collection, which brings together poems that express Mathilde Blind's distinctive kind of free thinking in compelling ways. And now's the time just to remind people, if you ever want to know how to pronounce her name, just think of the wonderful mockumentary, A Mighty Wind, and remind yourself that it's Mathilde Blind, being a German word and pronounced with the short I. Now, to go back to the Webster's dictionary we have in front of us here, it might be worth reminding everyone that Blind was, quote, at variance with what is usual in multiple ways in late Victorian England. She was a foreigner, born in Germany. She immigrated to London at age 10 when her parents were thrown out of various European countries for their revolutionary activities. She was Jewish, although she became an outspoken atheist, but noticed as a Jewess, as she was called, in a majority Protestant country. She was a socialist who counted fellow socialists like William Morris and Eleanor Marx, Karl Marx's daughter, among her close friends. And she was most prominently, and sometimes notoriously, a radical feminist who opposed the institution of marriage, called it the grave of woman's ambition at one point, believed in what the Victorians called free unions, and held extremely fluid ideas of gender and sexuality. In fact, a little known detail about her, she began her career by posing as a man, publishing her first volume of verse under the pseudonym Claude Lake. None of this went unnoticed. The pre-Raphaelite painter Dante Gabriel Rossetti wrote a ribald limerick about her presumed sexual promiscuity. Her first volume of poetry was withdrawn by the publisher after just a few weeks in bookshops because of fears of its, quote, atheistic character, unquote. And the daughters of painter Ford Madox Brown, who had been her friends, came to regard her with suspicion and tried to bar her from his household because of her close relationship with their married father. Virginia Woolf's father, Leslie Stephen, perhaps best summed up these negative sentiments about her in a letter warning a friend about Blind, characterizing her as, quote, one of Lucy Clifford's free-thinking friends, unquote. This canard was, of course, quite rich, coming from one of the period's most famous agnostics. In fact, one of the best books about Leslie Stephen is titled The Godless Victorian. But Stephen's loaded use of the term here is meant to convey the suspicions many held that Blind posed a danger to God, marriage, and the patriarchy. To pose a question you might have about her personal life using our contemporary vernacular, was Blind gay or straight? A simplified answer to this question might be that while Blind was attracted to certain men's minds, and certainly to their professional connections, very important to women writers at this time, it was women, their minds and their bodies, who most deeply stirred her. But her gender fluidity eludes these binaries, which is why I like Eve Sedgwick's definition of queering, shifting now from the noun to the verb, which seeks what Sedgwick calls an open mesh of possibilities, quote unquote, to disrupt traditional binary epistemologies that are constructed as oppositional and interdependent. By contrast, Sedgwick writes, queering seeks fluidity, dissonances, gaps, and excesses of meaning that materialize, quote, when the constituent elements of anyone's gender, of anyone's sexuality, aren't made or can't be made to signify monolithically, unquote. This comes closer to describing my sense of Blind's identity than terms like gay or straight. Consider the 6 dramatic monologues in Blind's 1891 volume, Dramas in Miniature, whose speakers are women. This is one of the 3 volumes, by the way, that's included in my edited edition, which is the least expensive of the books I've published, by the way, in case you're interested, and it's in paperback. These dramatic monologues include a nun whose midnight prayers channel her erotic desire. This is titled The Mystic's Vision. A dying, unrepentant prostitute in a poem titled The Message. A seduced and abandoned mother who gives her illegitimate child up for adoption, A Mother's Dream. A proud courtesan who flaunts her sexual availability in public, titled The Battle of Flowers. And the ghost of a bride-to-be whose unconsummated desire for her lover not even death can quell. And this comes from a Hungarian legend, and the title is The Song of the Villi, W-I-L-L-I, but pronounced with a V. None of these women in these dramatic monologues, none of these speakers of these poems are married. Several embody and assail the sexual double standard, and one of them expresses sexual longing and bliss without even requiring a partner. Late Victorian women poets often adopted the dramatic monologue because they could express radical ideas indirectly through the voices of speakers who are, in the words again of Webster, which you have in front of you here, quote, at variance with what is usual or normative in character, appearance, or action. In other words, queer. As illustration, I will end my paper today also by having us look at a poem. This one I don't have to show you, but I will read it. It's just a few stanzas from A Mystic's Vision, which I mentioned earlier. And I take this poem to include a coded representation of autoeroticism as the speaker lies in bed imagining the presence of God. God is mentioned in the poem, but Blind, of course, was known as an atheist, and there could be a blaspheming kind of quality to her evocation of God here, given the fact of what the woman is experiencing. So I prefer to think, especially because of the reference to hovering wings in the stanza, the first stanza I will read to you, that instead of God, it's possibly a metaphor for an angel of sensual delight who dwells within the speaker herself. So here are the three stanzas that I will read. This is from the middle of the poem. And suddenly across the gloom, the naked moonlight sharply swings. A presence stirs within the room, a breath of flowers and hovering wings. Your presence without form and void, beyond all earthly joys enjoyed. My heart is hushed, my tongue is mute. My life is centered in your will. You play upon me like a lute, which answers to its master's skill, till passionately vibrating, each nerve becomes a throbbing string. Oh, incommunicably sweet, no longer aching and apart, as rain upon the tender wheat, you pour upon my thirsty heart. As scent is bound up in the rose, your love within my bosom glows. Let me stop sharing again here so that you can once again see me. I think that worked, I hope. Yes, there we go. This poem, this fragment, the poem itself, like so many in the volume, Dramas in Miniature, which I heartily recommend to everyone, is queer in the most productive, free-thinking way possible. Like Blind herself in her life and in her writing, it forcefully represents every woman's right, every person's right to gender and sexual self-determination. Thank you, and I think we both welcome questions, and I think perhaps ER will channel them to us. Thank you again, ER.
Yes. So would love for folks to chime in with questions as you are able. Yes, so one from Emma Kearney, mostly for Leanne. I read Michael Field at Agnes Scott, but I didn't know about their connection to Berenson. I may be extrapolating based on their Catholic conversion, but were they similarly interested in the Renaissance, along with their interest in the classical periods? That's a great question.
And yes, definitely. All of their plays, are either set in the classical era or in the medieval era, and so that's sort of where their poetic output is centered. But their volume of poems called Sight and Song take one masterwork from European painting tradition and put it into words. They say in their preface, it's what the poems themselves express, that it's not subjective, it's what the poems objectively say. And all of the poems there are Renaissance poems, except for they have, I think, two French Rococo Watteau paintings. But they love the Renaissance era and they're fascinated by it, and they do a lot of reading. And part of it is also because of the influence of the book by Walter Pater called The Renaissance, where he also talks about the artists of that era. It was just, hugely influential on them.
Can you speak a little bit, both of you, as to how you came about these artists and writers? How did you discover them? Because they seem potentially like unlikely subjects. what led you to these folks?
I would say I'm happy to begin. I actually teach a grad class called English Literature in Transition, 1880 to 1920, and I found a fabulous little anthology called Aesthetes and Decadence of the 1890s. And this poet, Michael Field, was included. And I was curious, and I just decided to do a little more work, and I wrote an article on a poem called A Dance of Death, which is brilliant, wonderful. It reimagines Salome as having escaped from Herod, her home in Herod's palace, and gone to the north, and she is dancing on the ice. She slips through and her head is severed by a sheet of ice. This is great stuff. It's so weirdly wonderful. That drew me to them. And then I decided to write a book about turn of the century Victorian women poets. And it was going to be about forms of poetry and then talk about a bunch of women poets. And I wrote the first chapter on the Mask, and I talked about Dolly Radford and Michael Field. And I was writing the second chapter on sonnets, and I started out with Michael Field. Like, wait a minute, this is not a variety of poets anymore. And basically Michael Field sort of grabbed me by the collar and said, look, you're writing a book on us. I bet I tried to avoid it as much as I could. I had the whole plan for the other book laid out, and I just couldn't get away from them. And partly it's the wealth of manuscript materials that's out there. The diaries are just amazing. And if anyone is interested in the diaries, I think it's the Michael Field Diaries.dartmouth.edu has digitized all of the tens of thousands of diary pages. There's a big scholarly project to transcribe them. I have the rare skill of being able to read Catherine Bradley's handwriting, but it takes a minute. Only one of the volumes is fully transcribed now, but they are just fascinating. They are fascinating, and yeah, I tried to escape, and just when I thought I was out, they pulled me back in.
That's the best kind of research, right? What about you, James?
Yeah, it's a great question. I just noticed a question from Peggy that I can answer more briefly, and then I'll get back to your question. But Peggy is asking whether Blind English was her second language, and yes, it was. That actually became a point of criticism of Blind. The London Times, in their obituary essay about Blind, said, well, she wrote fairly well for a German, but they criticized her faulty polish as a poet. And this became one of the critical controversies about Blind. Was she a great English poet? She did write occasionally in German. There's a great German ode that she wrote for her mother's birthday. And I don't know if Barbara Drescher is still in our audience, but she helped me translate that very weird and wonderful German ode written in this pseudoline script that was impossible for me to even make out. And Barbara labored mightily to help me with that. So she mostly wrote in English. And as she developed as a poet, she got better and better at vernacular English. Her last couple of volumes, which is why I wanted to publish this edition, are much more comfortable with English, even its vernacular dimensions. But back to your question, ER, it's a really good one. I did my dissertation back in those days of the great tradition of F.R. Leavis, and was encouraged to look at the canon, the big canons of the tradition. So I wrote my dissertation on George Eliot and Charles Dickens, with side glances at Anthony Trollope. And I came across Mathilde Blind because she wrote the first biography of George Eliot. And she interested me because I'd never heard of her. And then several years later, a person was putting together a volume of essays on lesser known women Victorian poets. And he wrote to a bunch of us saying, are you interested in any of these names? And Blind was on the list. And I said, well, I'm interested in Blind because of this connection to George Eliot. And that's sort of what started me on the path. And I will mention that her biography of George Eliot is very interesting because Blind took the time to go back into the countryside where Marian Evans, who became George Eliot, was raised, And she interviewed a lot of her friends and family members and dug up these wonderful anecdotes about Marian Evans out in the barn milking cows, and talked about George Eliot's hands, or Marian Evans' hands, which were bigger than you would expect in a woman of that class and time. And she talks about the milking process and how they would enlarge your hands. And so subsequent biographers have used Mathilde Blind's biography as a kind of model of how to do not just archival research, but interview-based research, where you go back to the people who knew the subject of your biography. So it turns out to be quite an important biography that influenced biography for the next 100 years. The other thing I will mention is that the reason I finally decided to write a biography is a visit to the British Library, 20 years ago, in which I discovered a trove of letters exchanged between Mathilde Blind and Richard Garnett, who was the keeper of books in the printed books in the British Library. His daughter-in-law, by the way, was the first translator of all the great Russian writers. So she translated Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, and many others. But Richard Garnett himself was a great supporter of women writers who had no means of support otherwise. So the British Library became their school. And he encouraged her, he introduced her to a lot of tastemakers in London and helped her get published. He also had quite a strong platonic and probably also erotic attraction to Blind, and their letters are full of this kind of coded romancing that he was doing of her. She didn't reciprocate it exactly. But the letters are such a rich archive, and they bring these two people to life so vividly that I said to myself, my God, I want to try to impart some of this, this living presence of Blind on the page. And that's what convinced me that it was worth writing a biography. So thanks for that question.
I think so often people forget that like one of the key skills a researcher must have is being able to decode people's handwriting. It's so important. So I'm wondering, even in contemporary conversations about queerness, we spend a lot of time talking about assimilation or anti-assimilation. And I'm curious in terms of these subjects, whether you think to a certain extent the ways in which they resisted assimilation as women, but also as queer people, if that, what possibilities that opened up for them, what versus the sort of social losses that they may have incurred. I mean, even her relationship to socialism, which was potentially more mainstream than it is now. So I'm just curious, kind of, do you feel that their anti-assimilationism benefited their writing, and it may not be that cut and dry? But
no, that's also a really good question. I'll take it first just because I've been thinking about this recently. Again, a kind of simplified way to think about this is that Mathilde Blind began her career by proving herself as a man. And by that I mean, she wrote a very important review of a new edition of the poetry of Percy Bysshe Shelley, who became a kind of touchstone for late Victorian radicals, mostly males, but other writers as well. And it was published in the Westminster Review, which at the time was the leading intellectual journal in London. Not that many women wrote for it. Richard Garnett helped her to get entree into that journal. And she became part of what was called the Shelleyites. These were left-leaning, sometimes radical writers like Richard Garnett, William Michael Rossetti, and Swinburne, most importantly. And she wrote that essay in the style of a masculine reviewer, scoring points, making claims about Shelley herself that proved her own authority. And then she went on to translate this very important book by the German philosopher David Friedrich Strauss, who wrote this important book, Das Leben Jesu, The Life of Christ, which demythologized the Bible. And so I would say that in her first 10 years, she was writing like a man in certain ways. But in the 1880s, as there was an emerging, again, the words are hard to use, a lesbian or gay women's movement emerging, someone like Vernon Lee, who was well known as having same-sex affection and preferences, Blind gravitated to those women, invited them on country outings with her. She became more confident in once marginal position as I would call queer, non-binary woman. And she became a more forceful writer in vernacular and a writer whose poetry becomes more suggestive of same-sex desire. And so it's a very interesting development, career development, from kind of posing as a male writer to being much more fluid, both in her expressions of desire and her expressions of poetic language.
I see Sarah Parker in the chat, and I almost want to take the question to another expert, because I'm unsure how to answer this question of sort of assimilation or not, partly because both Bradley and Cooper presented as female, that they were, and stereotypically feminine females. They always dressed for dinner. This is never not a good time to get dressed up. And so that their outward appearance was very conforming. And so it had to be among people they knew would accept them, that they used other identities. It was in their journals, which they did write intending to be published. But they told their literary executor, to wait a while, but then, make sure this is well known. Sturge Moore did excerpt the Massive Diaries. So there's like a 500-page excerpt that's in print. I got a sort of used copy from the 30s because that's when it was published. But it's only sort of a fraction of what's there. But that's a place where they would talk about Michael and Henry. I also think they're a little bit ambivalent. There was a time in the diaries where you see Catherine Bradley going back through her entries and changing pronouns for Henry to he. And then later they're like, whatever. That sometimes it's he and sometimes it's she. And so so I'm not sure how, as I said, I'm not sure how to answer that question, because the ways I'm able to get into their head, I know are ways that they preserve for me, for them to show me this. And I'm never sure exactly what to do with this. Is this something authentic or is this performative? And that's right.
I think that's interesting. They're shaping the narrative even in death, which, can lead you in a number of different ways. We have a funny question from Peggy Thompson. Leanne, will you write next about the actor Bradley Cooper and his reintegrating Michael Field?
That's a great idea for a next project. I wish I had thought of it myself.
Yes. Natalie says, Jim, you are speaking about how important queer community is to emerging creatives, that affirming spaces nurture them, and that then supports a kind of creative freedom to grow. And I don't know if you want to speak to that.
Well, I was thinking about another way to answer your question, ER, but also to respond to Natalie, and that is that there's a lot of unsettling of literary studies going on, and there's a current web group called Unsettling the Victorians, and really the Unsettling the Canon is part of the project that I think Leanne and I and other women like scholars like Sarah Parker are involved in, other scholars generally are involved in. And one of the great benefits of Unsettling the Canon, obviously it widens the canon, but it introduces writers who, in the case of the queer community, were queer before there was language to describe them. And it takes scholarship to kind of, suss that out and make it public and talk about it. And so I think it's not that we want to throw out George Eliot and Dickens, both of whose novels I love, but rather we want to recognize that they represented a kind of they weren't mainstream exactly, but their novels were embraced by the mainstream. Let's put it that way. They could be read by middle-class conservative readers. Whereas people like Michael Field and Mathilde Blind had kind of question marks around them. So scholarship on queer writers, broadly speaking, queer studies can open the canon in really, really productive ways that, frankly, I've been in the profession for decades, and new theoretical approaches make my life so much more exciting and joyful because there are new ways to think about literature. I don't know if that helps answer your question, Natalie. But
and actually, I'd love to jump in because that also points to how important so many of these literary salons were. And they were just these informal gatherings. And there are some we know about, like the Rhymers Club that gathered at the Cheshire Cheese because people like Wilde and Yeats attended. But there were so many of these small communities. The other thing that was so important to Michael Field when they fell out of critical favor is they made friends in the early 1890s and were friends until their deaths with Charles Shannon and Charles Ricketts, both artists. Ricketts also known as a designer, especially in the theater world. And so Michael Field and Ricketts and Shannon became sort of best friends. There's a book manuscript that never got published in the British Library called The Poets and the Painters, and that's how they thought of themselves, but it was this aesthetic community. And there's this wonderful quotation where, and actually I think they took the calling their partner my fellow from Ricketts and Shannon, because that's what they called each other. And Ricketts and Shannon lived together for over 20 years in a marriage-like relationship that they never called marriage, and said that these two men live and love and work together and nurture each other just as we do. And so that was that meeting them, they were sort of at a low ebb of their critical reception, and they were productive again. And Ricketts designed their book covers and they gave each other feedback on their works. And there are so many descriptions of going to the studio and looking at paintings. The other thing Michael Field did when they bought a house of their own was on the Thames in Richmond, sort of near Kew Gardens in London. And they called it the Paragon. And they built a sort of palace of art. And they had all of their friends. Berenson chose the artworks. Ricketts helped them choose the furniture because they wanted a place that was beautiful and fit for the kind of creative world building that they and their friends wanted to take part of.
I love that. I don't know how much y'all are pay attention to social media, but one of the things that I appreciate about young scholars is the sort of memification of some of these ideas. And there's a great one that is like a picture of two women kissing, and it would be like, 20th century literature scholars be like, they were very good friends, right? that all, particularly women, that just had even romantic friendships, right? But this idea, the desexualization of all relationships, and it is really important, I think, to queer people that we not just have that whole the assumption not just be made that of course they were friends, right? Like even that if we have to err on the side of assuming something, perhaps we just err on the side of assuming the opposite, right? That maybe they were sexual together. But for so long, people had been so delicate about that and so afraid of assuming homosexuality because that would be so offensive, that now people are like, yeah, why don't we assume the other direction? Because Occam's razor would suggest that if you spent 40 years of your life as roommates with someone, maybe something else, right? Like perhaps something else was going on. But I appreciate the humor that I think younger scholars are bringing to that, and the frustration, that's being allowed to because and that feels new to me, because I remember, even studying English, in graduate school 20 years ago and being the only queer person in my program and having everybody be like, well, that person wasn't gay. No, like, we don't know that. How do you know that? Right. And that burden of proof around those things and how isolating that can be for queer scholars, but also just for people who are looking for evidence of themselves across history. So it's exciting to have books like this where folks can find themselves, and I'm very grateful to y'all for that.
I have to admit, I was a little worried about saying, they also were attracted to men, because I didn't want to say these are not queer women, because it does sort of take away that example. And it was hugely important in this sort of history of sort of lesbian poetry. but I also think that makes them more interesting because they just can't be put into a little box and say, this is the limits of what they could be.
Well, and I think bisexual and queer representation is, they don't have to just be lesbians, right? Like, I think that's also really important and really great.
And to your point about assimilation, ER, one of the negative aspects of that assimilation that we talked about is that I suspect that Mathilde Blind had physical relations with women, but she would not have been, she would have felt it would harm her reputation in literary London to openly express that. Other women who were known as gay didn't express it openly either. She took a trip out into the country with Mona Caird, who wrote a famous essay against marriage. And she writes descriptions of Mona Caird, which are just full of sensuous physical descriptions of Mona Caird's physical beauty. And, it comes pretty close to saying we've loved each other physically, but I couldn't quite say that in the biography. So I just led readers to see the sensuous appreciation of her body in her descriptions and hope that readers would recognize that I'm not trying to say they didn't have a physical relationship. So,
right. I think, sometimes all you can do is show people the text and allow modern readers to make their own assumptions, which I think is appropriate, as opposed to making the sort of the assumption of heterosexuality, which is what it has felt like has been the assumption for so long, or even of cisgender-ness, right? That has also been the assumption, and I think it's certainly interesting to at least allow light into that room, and allow people to see the text. And of course, we're bringing our own contemporary, assumptions and desires to the page. But well, thank you both so much. We are right at time. Thanks to everyone watching at home. We really appreciate all of you and your great thoughts. We want to encourage you. You can click this teal button to buy both Leanne and James's books from Charis. You can also, I dropped the links, the recommended reading that Leanne suggested further up in the chat directly from Charis. So if you want to learn more about Michael Field and their works, you may do so by checking those things out. But thank y'all both so much for this. It is always a pleasure to learn more. And if folks, is there any other sort of last thing you want to shout out, or other reference or resource you hope folks will learn more about?
There's too many. I would say my own book is way too expensive. It's meant to be bought by university libraries, but there are some great regularly priced things that I strongly encourage people to check out. Emma Donoghue has a really nice, very readable biography. She wrote Room, right? She's a really good writer. Yes, in the chat, I think those are good resources. And I'm so grateful to Charis and ER for having us.
Thank you, ER. Thanks
of course.
Again.
Our pleasure. Well, take care and congratulations on this. And we look forward to continuing to spread these legacies of these people, because more and more people need to know about them. So thank you both so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.